This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast network. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. I want to thank my latest patron, Ruby. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. You too can have an ad-free experience of the podcast by becoming a patron at any level at patreon.com/gracefulatheist. You don't have to go through the deconstruction and deconversion process alone. Please consider joining the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group, which includes various hangouts, book clubs, discussion groups. You can find that at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. A quick shout out to my sibling podcasts on the Atheist United Studios podcast network, Amusing Jews, Beyond Atheism, and The Humanist Experience. Please check out those podcasts. You can find them on the Atheist United website at atheistunited.org. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. My guests today are Troy and Brian of the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast. Troy and Brian have done some amazing work. You can hear the experience of having had faith and having experienced the downside and coming through on the other side. They both deconstructed at different times, but they've remained friends. And after they found each other after deconversion, they decided to make a podcast and talk about it. They are from Australia, as you will immediately recognize, and the Assemblies of God was the faith tradition that they were both a part of at one time or another. Troy and Brian have created a community much like our own, the Deconversion Anonymous group. For this podcast, they have the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist group on Facebook as well. Please check out their podcast, I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. There will be links in the show notes. Here are Troy and Brian to tell their stories. Brian and Troy, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you. It's awesome to be here with our chat that we had with you late last year. So it's great to reciprocate and come on your podcast. So thank you.
Yeah, it's a bit of fun.
Yeah, you guys are part of a really popular podcast called I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. And I think you're very authentic. The fundamentalist experience that you guys had, I think really comes through than your experience on the other side. We're kind of a sister-cousin podcast to one another, and I think this is a really great crossover.
We've watched your podcast for a little while, and when I say watch, I mean watching what you've been doing, but also listening and stuff. So yeah, it's really cool to be connecting with you, because I just feel there's such a synergy, and what you're trying to achieve is very much in line with what we're trying to achieve too. So thanks for having us on, David.
Yeah, absolutely, and I love to give the opportunity to to cross-pollinate our communities, because I think our communities can benefit from listening to each other's podcasts. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, quite often cities have like sister cities, don't they? So
that's right.
Let's have a sister podcast.
There you go.
Graceful. Yeah, here we go. We're connected. we're forging new ground. This is what we do.
That's right. What is very typical on my podcast is to begin with people's stories of their faith experience. So if we can, we're going to do like 10 or 15 minutes each on your personal stories of what your religious faith is like, and maybe a bit about your deconversion story. And just because of the ordering that's on my screen, I'm going to have Troy go first.
Yeah, cool. Well, I was converted to Christianity through school. I was brought up in a family where we were told that we were Christians, but we didn't even go to church on, Easter and Christmas and that kind of thing. I know that my mother had bought us all a children's Bible, but Australia is a very secular nation in a lot of ways, or at least post-Christian in a lot of ways. And so whilst we wore the label, it didn't really matter. Even at Christmas time, Christmas was more about Santa than it was about anything else. But my mother had a friend that had been involved in the Catholic Charismatic Renewal movement. And I used to listen to my mother and her friend tell stories about being involved in this, and well, not so much my mother's stories, but her reaction to her friend being involved in this. So I'd heard about speaking in tongues and healing and these kinds of things. And so I was quite open to the idea of this. And when a Christian band came through my school telling us all about Jesus, it made a bit of a a kerfuffle in. Do you say that in the US? Kerfuffle, is that a word that
Sure.
you use? Yeah,
Yeah.
you do. Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, made a bit of a kerfuffle in my school, and some kids got converted, and then through a fallout, I also, ended up giving my life to Christ, as we say, and then I joined a Pentecostal group, which turned out to be quite an extreme cult, very
Mm.
similar to what's called the United Pentecostal Church in the US. So we had to speak in tongues to be saved. We didn't fellowship with any other churches. And I was involved with them quite heavily till about 17. And at that age, I'd started to realize that this was not how I wanted to live, because my family had never joined. And so I still had this measuring stick at home that I could say, this is what acceptance looks like. This is what love looks
Mm.
like. And so I ended up having myself kicked out. And please go back and have a listen to my podcast stories about that. I don't want to bore you too much, but I had myself kicked out. I worked out how to do that. And then as I was leaving, they were like, "Oh, by the way, you're probably damned to hell." And I was like, "Oh," and that didn't quite sit so well with me. So
Mm.
I went and started doing, clubbing and partying and all the things that you would do at sort of 17, until I came to a point in my life where I didn't like where I'd landed. I didn't like where this lifestyle had sort of taken me, even though I was still quite young. And I had a friend of mine who had by this stage joined an Assemblies of God church, which is where this original group that I was a part of had come from. And so I went along with him, and got a good dose of guilt, and also saw the idea of, the things that I'd done over the last few years could be forgiven. And as I said, I wasn't really happy with the way I'd sort of journeyed and the way I'd sort of become. And so I, recommitted my life to Christ, and, uh, joined the AOG basically. And long story short, ended up finishing Bible college, involved in church plants, involved in a series of different churches, left the AOG, became involved in the Australian Baptist Union, later in the Australian Churches of Christ. And then my marriage really hit the rocks, and I started to deconvert. It's funny because in even saying that now, I say I started to deconvert. No, I think I started to deconvert the day I joined, really.
Yeah.
And because as you're studying, as you're looking into it all, you come across these issues, you come across these contradictions. But the other thing was what Josie McSkimming, who is one of the guests on our podcast. I don't know if you've heard from her yet, but she's wonderful. She's a clinical social worker who specializes in religious trauma. And she said to us, there's these sites of injury. There's these incidents that happen that
Mm.
just build up over time. And I think that's what happened to me, David. I think the sites of injury built up, the inconsistencies of the religion. My study was probably the worst thing I could have done for my faith, because I took it seriously and studied the Bible and studied theology and looked at the contradictions. And yeah, long story short, I deconverted in about 2004, stopped church in about 1999, deconverted in about 2004. Back in the day where there was no such thing as deconstruction. I mean, that was Jacques Derrida talking about art and things,
Right.
let alone religion. But yeah, then found my way into the whole Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, that kind of stuff, and the Infidels website. And back in the day, there was a bulletin board online called Walk Away, which was for ex-fundamentalists. I don't know if it still exists anymore, but it was a very isolating experience.
Mm.
And I'd headed overseas just to sort of leave everything behind. And yeah, here I am now. As I said, I really came to a point of deconversion 2004. So we're nearly coming up on 20 years, but I'm still unpacking it, David. Still to this day, I'm unpacking things, and stepping in and out of therapy at times to talk about some of this stuff. But yeah, that's my story.
I really like that idea, sites of injury. That's really evocative. We say sometimes that it's not one thing; it's 1,000 things. So that's an interesting way to express that. Yeah. So I mean, I relate to so much of that, and I will recommend to my listeners when Troy says go listen to his story. He literally did get himself kicked out intentionally. So you got to go listen to that story. It's really good. All right, Brian, let's hear about your story.
Uh, well, my story was I grew up in a home where spirituality was there, but certainly not church, certainly not Jesus or God. I tell this in my story on the podcast as well. Around we grew up having seances as a family.
Oh, okay.
That yeah, that was we like to connect with the dead cousins. Um, so that was, I guess, my experience of spirituality, and it would also we'd speak about the afterlife, we'd speak about reincarnation. I was always fascinated by those sort of things growing up, and I had this book called Unexplained Mysteries, and it was all of those sort of things about portals and or
Yeah.
it was rubbish, but it was fascinating, and that was probably the thing that primed me for my Christian experience, which didn't start till I was 17. I hadn't really been involved in a church at all. Well, not really. I haven't. I hadn't at all. Most of my siblings, I've got 7 siblings, and most of them grew up with some sort of nominal Catholic sort of connection to the church. They'd be pulled along on the occasional Sunday, but the next sister, um, my next sister up in me in the level, she was never exposed to it either, and either was I. But when I was probably, I reckon, 14 or 15, one of my brothers became a Christian. And it was one of those conversion stories. He was a fan of drugs, and everyone saw him convert, and the drug use stopped. And very much like you spoke to us about your mum's conversion
Hmm.
story,
Yeah.
it was a very similar thing. So, but he used to evangelize the hell out of us, and he lived in another state in Australia, and he would ring, and we would have to hang up on him. Like he was just so fearful we were all going to die
Mm.
and go to hell.
Yeah.
So I thought it was bullshit. I thought that it's all rubbish. But anyway, when I was 17, I decided to go and visit him. He lived in Queensland in Australia, and he was a surfer, so it's in a surf community. It's the sort of place you'd go for a holiday. So I went up there and I got converted to this bullshit. Um,
Okay.
I went up actually with all these provisos that if I stayed with them, they weren't allowed to speak about God or Jesus. They weren't allowed to have a Bible around, and if they had a Bible, it could be in their bedroom only. I was
Yeah.
just a prat, but they stuck to that, to their
Yeah.
own credit. And it was me through seeing the contrast of how that brother had been, and by this time, another brother had become a Christian, and another sister had become a Christian. It was just like it was spreading. There was revival in our family, brother.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I gave it a shot. I became a Christian, and I was 17. Did the thing. Then I came back to Melbourne, where I live in Australia, and back then, I didn't have any connection with church, so I had to seek something out. It was pre-internet. This is 1991. I was having no, it wasn't. It was 1989 actually, and so I was just basically going around and seeing where these churches were. It was a church called Christian City, which was a large Pentecostal church.
Hmm.
I found one, connected with it, just kept dropping in and out till I was about 19, and then connected with Pentecostalism through an independent church, and really felt part of it. I think it was the connection, it was the community, it was the ability to be able to. I would say I felt accepted. It was absolutely conditional. There was
Right.
no doubt. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
conditional on me behaving and conforming. But I was happy to do that at the time, as long as it meant connection. But then I ended up at an AOG church where Troy and I met when I was, I don't know, I was maybe 19 by that time. And that was my Pentecostal experience. Was very, very short, really. It was 3.5, 4 years. I had a devolution very similar to Troy's. Then left that experience. I was the same. I went to Bible college. Was on that trajectory to become a pastor. Saw that as a career path. You can be a career Christian. Why not?
Yeah.
Why not
Yeah.
get paid for it? So I tried all that, but then I ended up halfway through Bible college, um, thinking I just can't survive on this money. Like
Mm.
I'd become engaged around that time, and I thought I'm just going to go back to work. I'll come back to Bible college later, but I've just got to go work a while. And I never went back to Bible college, but I did stay connected with the church. The Toronto blessing started to happen around that time, and for me, I just that repulsed me. I
Mm.
called bullshit on it. Um, so that actually caused me to have a bit of a fallout with. At that time, I was in leadership, in youth leadership in the AOG church, and the pastor there, I just said to him, "I can't stay. I think it's rubbish," and
Yeah.
I left. Went to a Baptist church, so a bit more moderate. Obviously they weren't Christians because there was no Toronto blessing happening there. Um, so I felt again connected, but drifted, and then ended up at a Church of Christ. So Troy and I, even though at this time we were hanging out a little bit, it was just the same journey out, and it was more moderate, more moderate, more moderate. Um, I was involved in Churches of Christ. I lived interstate for about 11 years, and that's where I ended up connecting with Church of Christ, and then came back to Melbourne, where I then went to the Church of Christ here. And really, it was quite progressive,
Mhm.
and there was a lot of experimenting with church. There was a lot of there was meditation sessions. There was, hey, let's not have any preaching this week. Let's all just hang out in groups and talk about shit that happened this week,
Mhm.
and how we can connect as community.
No wonder you
And
fell away.
yeah, I,
They stopped with what worked, brother.
that's exactly right. And my university training is a social worker. So social justice is incredibly
Okay.
important to me, and so at this time, it was really connecting with the social justice mission of the Churches of Christ. I was involved in a few different offshoots of social justice groups, and I think it was just bit by bit things started to fall away in literal resurrection. Look, seriously, that shit didn't happen. Um, the personal relationship with God, really, how does he have a personal relationship with 7 billion people if everyone converted? That doesn't work. I'm just putting, when I'm praying, it's just going out in the ether. So bit by bit, I just started to think, I don't think that this is actually true, but I didn't want to come out and say it. There's a lot of fear sitting behind it. Um, so I was married at that time. I'd met my now ex-wife in church, in a
Mhm.
Pentecostal church. So, but we'd both sort of journeyed out and probably started to deconvert to some degree. We'd had children. The kids were involved in church, but probably not at the degree where others thought that they should be.
Okay.
Um, so things were falling away, but then probably 12-ish, maybe even 13 years ago, my marriage broke down. And it was at the point where my marriage broke down that I walked away because it gave me an out. There was, yeah, we were habitually going to church. Um, I hadn't had really, I don't think, any real belief for quite a while. And so it gave me the ability to cut that. But I was still very afraid at the time to go, I actually don't think I believe the Jesus story. I really don't think that there's a literal heaven or hell. I don't, and that took me a while. And it's probably even a 10-year deconversion journey post that 13 years of completely leaving the church, and I'm still deconstructing and I'm still trying to work it out. And so what do you do when you do that? Well, you and one of your close mates, you start a podcast.
That's right.
Mm.
So I think it's fascinating that both of you, it seems like an inflection point was the end of a relationship. And kind of a theory that I kick around a lot is the idea that faith is very much a community sustained thing, and that, for example, during 2020 when we were doing lockdowns, I theorized that I bet a lot of people are going to deconstruct during this time because they're out of the context of church. So, Brian, you said you were habitually going to church, and so the second you're not doing that, that kind of sustaining force of that faith goes away. And I think for many people, that gives them a little bit of space to then think, is this something I really believe or not? And without someone right over their shoulder saying, "Of course you believe, of course you do."
Yeah, absolutely, and particularly in Australia, we're not a Christian nation. We weren't found. It's not like the States where God is everywhere. Um, so here, there you don't walk out the front door and bump into something or someone else that's going to keep you in that bubble. And I definitely, the bubble sustained me for a
Hmm.
long time, and it was just the fact that my social connections, my community connections were all within that church bubble. And you're right, as soon as I left that, I didn't fear not believing necessarily anymore. I
Hmm.
might not have come out and said it, but I didn't have that fear. Whereas a lot of, even though I was at a very progressive Churches of Christ, it was still fear based. It was still, if you stopped believing, if you, that formula that was there for a reason, and it kept you within the salvation bubble. And if you leave it, well, you risk your soul.
Yeah, and it also sounds like that having a brother who really believed it, who, if you take hell seriously, that's actually the correct response, right? If this is real, you had better be on everybody's case to convert because they're going to hell. And so I think I sometimes say that it's not that Christians take things too seriously, it's that they don't take them seriously enough. Like what it actually says, what the actual core of Christianity is deadly. And if you take that seriously, there's a certain reaction that would be appropriate to that.
I was going to say, and it was a strange time to like, and we often talk about this on the podcast. Troy and I have very different responses to our Christianity. Christianity, I wasn't into evangelizing. I wasn't even into sharing my faith with people. Um, and in hindsight, I'm not quite sure that I had a depth of belief even back then. I was just going through the steps. I was connecting with community. I was feeling like I
Mm.
belonged, that I was accepted. So I kept ticking that stuff along. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was very sincere in my belief, but I'm not sure about the depth of it. And I think that's why it was probably easy for me to walk away in the end, because I don't think I'd ever truly, because I always struggled with that attitude of the other. That other person out there, they're not saved, or so and so. We should treat them differently because they're not a Christian.
Mhm.
That they haven't said these 15 words that make them a Christian. I just always struggled with that. I struggled with that sense of the other, and that you had to rescue them, because I didn't necessarily see what they were involved with is dangerous, or need rescuing from. So I was a bad Christian, really, is
Yeah.
what I'm trying to say.
When you see the humanity of out atheists or out LGBTQ people, and you just realize actually they're really good parents, they're really good people. Like, I'd kind of like to be like them. It's hard to hate that type of person. Troy, what I want to hear is you guys were friends at one point in time and you've kind of gone on your journeys in parallel tracks. How aware of each other were you as you were going through this moderation and deconstruction process?
Well, when we were in the Assemblies of God, towards the end of my time, Brian had r- sort of grown up in the ranks or grown up into the ranks of the youth group, and I had gone away to be a youth pastor of another church. So when I came back, because that didn't quite work out, when I came back, talk about this, away from the supporting community. When I came back, I felt like they had changed.
Mm.
The whole church had changed, but actually, it was probably more me that my experience had changed me, and I disconnected from that community and that community's norms. And so I started to challenge what was going on in that church, but from a Christian perspective. And that didn't land. That didn't land at all. And so I, ended up out on my ass, as we say in Australia, and really looking for a better version of Christianity. And Brian was still quite embedded in that, still quite enmeshed in that. And then only a few months later, I think he started to sort of go, which we heard in his story, started to say, "Oh, this doesn't quite add up for me." And so we connected again quite quickly because we had grown up in a similar part of town. We had very similar socioeconomic backgrounds. We enjoyed the same music. This is before church. And then I think we connected on that because we hadn't been raised in the church. We had a genuine friendship, I think
Mm-hmm.
is a good way to put it. And
Yeah.
so when I had journeyed away, when, as often happens, as you know, with people that leave, the religion, they reconnect with people who have also left and reforge relationships. And that's when you find out who your real friends were and who were just
Absolutely.
church acquaintances. So yeah, I think as that happened, we reconnected in the what we call the Baptist space, because it was still Pentecostalish, but it was also not. And but then I think when I finally walked away from religion, Brian was still in it, and I think we stayed in touch. We sent emails to each other. I was living overseas, but then when I eventually came back from overseas, which was about 12 years later, by that stage Brian's marriage had broken down, and we were in a place where we could reconnect as friends. And his religion, I don't think you quite walked away yet, Brian. I think you were still holding on to it in name only. But I was happily saying, I'm an atheist. I think this is all bullshit. And that wasn't an issue. And so we,
Mm-hmm.
continued on as friends. And then we maintained our friendship as unchurched, as non-believers. We both, repartnered with non-believing women and had kids and all the things that you do. And during the COVID lockdown, because Melbourne, where we live, is one of the most locked down cities in the world, at least one of the
Mm-hmm.
biggest cities. Although now with what's going on with China, that may not be true, but at least up to that point it was. And I was listening to a lot of deconstruction podcasts and listening to a lot of these. And I say young people because compared to me, they were beginning this journey, and they were sort of moving into sort of this progressive space. And I realized that some of the fear was still there. So I reached out to Brian and I said, "Hey, I want to join this conversation, and no one's going to have me on the Liturgist podcast or any of these other
Yeah.
kind of things. So let's do our own with a uniquely Australian voice." And so we did, and here we are, as you heard in our episode, nearly 2 years later, and we're still going. And like you, we're never going to run out of content. I think the only time we'll probably stop this is when we've had enough, because this
Exactly.
story is going to continue to be told. And as you said to us in the episode when you came on our podcast, was this is not new, and people have walked this road. Whole denominations have walked this road, where they have become liberal and then become, secular humanists. And we used to look at them and go, how could we ever become like that? And yet here we are in that exact space, So yeah, so that was our journey.
And then we also talked a bit off, I think off mic, about how doing this work benefits us as well, that there's an aspect of this is our outlet, that kind of thing. So Brian, I want to hear what the focus of the podcast was. Like what, Troy mentioned a uniquely Australian voice. What were you guys trying to accomplish? And what is the background to the podcast?
I think we set out to tell our stories and tell, our podcast starts with, and we sort of cringe when we look back at our first couple of episodes, just that, obviously your craft, you grow into it. But we started out telling our stories and how we actually became involved. So it's a bit of a deeper dive into that than the blurb that we just gave at the start here. But you get the sense of who we are, where we came from. But then we started talking about our experience and calling out some of the absurdities, calling out most definitely our experience of cognitive dissonance. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of things that we towed the line knew that it just didn't make sense, but you did it because you did it for Jesus. Um, so
Yeah.
it it's that sort of rubbish. But we just started to dive into talking a lot about our experiences, but then very very quickly, I think, like you described in the episode with us, you start to think about, well, there's got to be others. Who do we start to have a conversation with about their experience? So we'd bring people in and we'd start to talk about, hey, what was your experience? How did you go through this space? How did you navigate it? And then people started connecting. We started an online community where people come together to process and to talk about the stuff that is happening for them in their lives. And quite
Mhm.
often it's pegged to an episode. So we'll drop an episode and people will go, oh, when, so and so said that, I really connected with it, but I just don't know how to work through this. And you'll have a bunch of people who will jump in, really help each other try and navigate what they're going through, try and make sense of it. As you
Mhm.
know, when you've been in Christianity for so long, you've operated within such a confined environment that where you can process things, that when the floodgates are open and you can actually start to use some of your brain power, sometimes it can become a scary place for people. So we've done that with the podcast. It's been storytelling. It's been a lot of our storytelling, of our experiences. It's been guests coming in. Sometimes it's been a therapeutic bent where we bring someone in who's an expert in a particular area, like Josie McSkimming that we spoke about, and that religious trauma. With recovering from religion, with Daryl Ray. We've had all of those sort of people come in as well to talk about their experience. But I think the story connection is a big thing. The sense making is a big thing for people, being able to know that they're not alone. And we want to continue that. And it's become far more popular than we thought it would become. A lot more people have connected with it than we ever thought, and I think it's the beauty of the current environment where anyone can have a voice, and it's something in the church where unless you're actually anointed to have a voice, then you don't get one. But
Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
yeah, so now anyone can tell their story, and I think there's such a power in human connection. There's a power in sense making and story making of our lives, and I think that's where we are.
It definitely, that what comes across is the honesty and the vulnerability. And, as we've said a few times, I think that is really a powerful thing. People come along and they can say, I'm not alone. These people have experienced this as well. And it comes from that willingness to kind of, for lack of a better term, bare your soul a bit. And I think that's that human connection that's super powerful. I want to ask a question, and I want to give you the opportunity to tell me to F off if, if this is too personal. But I noticed that you guys began with a level of anonymity of just your first initials. And at some point, you began to use your first names. Talk me through that. What were you trying to accomplish there? And why are you a little more open these days?
Yeah, when we first started, I was afraid because we were going to be bagging out Hillsong and bagging out the Australian Assemblies of God, now called the Australian Christian Churches. I was a bit worried about us getting sued.
Mm,
Years before, I was involved in a group called the Revival Centers, and years before, in the '90s, when I was what we called, deprogramming. Isn't it funny the way it's gone from deprogramming to deconversion to
yeah.
deconstruct?
Yeah.
Um, but I was involved in I guess bringing down this revival centers movement, and we were threatened with legal action a number of times. So I wasn't sure how far this was going to go. I didn't think we were going to go quite as blatant as I did in the sort of counter revival center days, but nevertheless, let's set up for that. The other thing too is we both have professional lives, and
Yeah.
we didn't know how this was going to be received in that space as well. And both of those have proven to be not true. Both of them have proven to be positive. So we have just recently started, well, not just recently, at the end of last year, we started using our first names. And then recently, when we have promoted. We've even used our last names in some of the things that we've done as well. So it was sort of an opening up. It was a testing of the waters and to see what's going to happen, because Hillsong, for example, is quite litigious and they do try and shut people down. But we've sort of made the decision as well that we won't come out with any sort of accusations, etc., that aren't firsthand or that aren't already on the public record. And in that sense, I don't think we're going to be sued anytime soon. But yeah, that was where we were coming from, and that has come at a cost. Like, I've had my ex-wife contact me and been very concerned about what I'm going to say
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
podcast, things like that. So that does come at a cost, but I think we've pretty much weathered that storm. I don't think anything's going to happen anytime soon.
I definitely went
Yeah.
through a similar process. I wanted to protect my family. You're doing this on the internet, and who knows? And growing a bit more comfortable, maybe even naively so. We'll see. We'll see if that ever turns out to have been a bad decision. But I understand that impetus to, like, I want to have my voice out there, but I'm not quite ready to be fully known. The next topic I want to get to is, we clearly have similar backgrounds, both in kind of Pentecostalism, charismatic in the general, and specifically Assemblies of God. What I don't know as clear to US listeners is how big a deal Hillsong is in Australia. So I'd like to talk about the experience of, you guys call it the Great Big AOG for Assemblies of God, but Pentecostalism in general and Hillsong specifically within Australia.
Yeah, look, I think Pentecostalism within Australia is quite a small thing. Like
Oh,
it's a fairly small slice. However, it's a very influential slice of Christianity, and some of that has been through Hillsong and its success, particularly with its music. It hit the Australian ARIA charts. It's hit Billboard over in the States. I mean, it's been hugely, hugely successful. So I think that has been part of its exposure and influence here. But we also recently, until about a year ago, had a Pentecostal prime minister who was part of the Australian Christian churches, and he very much brought his beliefs into the way that he governed Australia. He connected, and he'd been to Hillsong.
hmm
He denied he'd been to Hillsong, but someone shared photos of him with Brian Houston, the then senior global pastor at Hillsong. It was a very strange denial. He, he tried to get Brian Houston into a meeting with Trump when Trump was your president. So he definitely tried to leverage it. So I think Pentecostalism got an exposure through that.
okay.
But Hillsong's it's been a huge thing. I mean, we had a royal commission into institutional sexual abuse. So it looked at different institutions such as churches, homes, the environment that people had been in foster environments or whatever. And Hillsong came to the fore through that as well, because Brian Houston, the global senior pastor, as he liked to call himself, of Hillsong, his father had sexually abused children in
Mm,
New Zealand, which is the country the Houstons came from, and that had been covered up by Brian Houston.
okay.
So he's actually been charged with covering that up. He's looking at a prison term, and he also has been thrown out as pastor of Hillsong. And Hillsong, I know, has gone crazy over in the States too, in New
Yeah.
York and also LA, and it's been the Church of the Stars with Justin Bieber and many other artists becoming involved with them, and whether Pratt's involved as well, Christopher Pratt or something like that. I don't know. There's quite a few Hollywood stars involved.
And the music too. I think non-Pentecostal churches that are evangelical, like, will do lots of Hillsong music as well. So it's had a huge influence from that perspective.
Yeah, it has. It's been massive, and I think that was their watershed moment when they first started hitting the charts here. And it's a massive church. I mean, it meets in a stadium. It's your typical type of mega church, and it's in the media a lot. Like we actually have journalists here who their focus is Hillsong. So
Mm.
someone in Hillsong farts and they report on it. It's quite nuts. But I don't know what you'd say, Troy, about any further about that. I mean, we weren't necessarily connected with Hillsong. Hillsong came out of the Australian Christian Churches, or the AOG, and we were, I guess, the church we were involved with at the time was definitely, it fit the bill of a mega church. It was probably bigger than Hillsong at the time, before Hillsong really broke. But Hillsong was sort of an offshoot. It was something to the side we weren't involved with.
Okay, I see.
I
Okay.
think the thing to note though is that there's a revolving door with Australian Pentecostal churches. Even though they may be small numbers, there's a lot of people go through them and come out the other side. I would dare say that there's more ex Pentecostals than there are Pentecostals. So our story is not unique. So in that sense, I think there is also an influence. Most people in Australia would know someone who's been involved in a mega church or in a Pentecostal church, even though they don't have the numbers, they don't have the political clout that you see in the US.
Yeah, I think in the U.S., and probably someone will correct me the minute I say this, but I would say the Southern Baptist Convention has kind of, as a single entity, has the kind of the biggest influence in the U.S. But Assemblies of God is still widespread throughout the U.S. as well. I've had people ask me this question. I'm going to ask you guys this question. Had you been a part of a more progressive tradition, and actually I want to get to this concept of the difference between liberalism and progressive, but I just mean less theologically conservative. Do you think you would have had the same deconstruction experience?
I think the answer to that for me is the question is really moot because I was recruited via a Pentecostal cult. I had
Okay.
no experience of Christianity in any sort of meaningful way. I journeyed out of Pentecostalism into more moderate, eventually to becoming a sort of a progressive, but it was always a journey out.
Hmm.
So I think the attraction of community, the attraction of forgiveness, the attraction of a meaning and a purpose. I remember in Bible college once, a pastor said to us, he said, the problem with liberal churches is, he said, they don't convert anyone. They don't bring anybody in. And he said, as a matter of fact, they are, what did he call them? A parasite on the true church.
Wow.
And I think there's some truth to that without the vitriol. I think there's some truth to that most of these progressive groups, most of these progressive denominations, there's very few converts. It's mostly refugees from conservative theology that sort of end up there. So no, I don't think that I would have even possibly been recruited into that sort of church. But ultimately, when I did journey out of Pentecostalism or out of fundamentalism, out of evangelicalism into something more progressive, I made a conscious decision. It's like, well, what's here? Nothing. There's nothing here that I need. I can be a good person. I can be, a humanist. I can be uh, a giver of my time and energy and effort and money to charities, etc. If I want to do good, I don't need fairy tales. I don't need, mythology. So, I don't think I would have ever been drawn into that kind of church in the first place, David.
That would probably be similar to my answer, but I still want to hear Brian's as well.
No, very similar. I came into the bright lights and the band of a Pentecostal church, and the really cool acceptance, and I became a Christian in a surf community, so it was very cool. There's a bunch of very cool people there, ex hippies. I think that connected me into it. There was a bit of a reality in what they were doing. And it was a performance, and I connected to that performance. I journeyed out, as we heard before, the same route as Troy, through the Baptist-Costal, through the more progressive churches of Christ. So even when I tried to make sense of tried to make sense of what I believed, it still didn't work. Like I was always I was on a trajectory to journey out, in the day that I journeyed in.
You've said that a couple of times. It reminds me of a quote from Bart Campolo. Somebody asked him, when did you start to doubt? And he said, about 15 minutes after I started to believe. and I think there's some deep honesty there, right? Like lots of people would jump on that and say, see, you didn't really have any faith. But I think there's just honesty in that statement and the way that you're expressing it as well.
David, can I just footnote? I think
Please.
that's exactly where I got that comment from. I think it came from Bart Campolo that the day I joined was the day I started to leave. So, yeah, footnote there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Trey, I heard you working through, and we're going to get to the source of this, but in a minute. But a difference between liberal versus progressive Christian. I wonder if you would expound on that and what you were trying to capture in describing that difference.
Yeah, look, it could just be semantics. It could just be a matter of terminology. But back in the day, to be a liberal Christian was worse than being a non-Christian. You know, because you didn't believe in the basic tenets of the Christian faith, you didn't believe in the basic creeds. Why are you even calling yourself a Christian? You know, it's a wolf in sheep's clothing would have been the way that we would have used it. And I think that term became, for most conservatives, for most evangelicals, it was a term that you never wanted to wear. And you never wanted to believe that you were ever going to become a liberal or a liberal Christian. And so I think what happened is that as that term became more and more pejorative, people just came up with new terms. You know, and we see that all the time. We see that in political correctness. We see that in even we talked about it before, from deprogram to deconversion to deconstruct. It all seems to become a little less offensive, and then it'll come full circle, and people will start using it again. I think it's the same kind of thing with that term. So people adopted this word progressive, and I think, John Shelby Spong, Marcus Borg, all these poster boys for liberalism would be quite happy to wear the modern label of progressives. And I think a lot of progressive Christians would be wearing that label. Happy to read those books if they really got in and had a look at what those people were saying. Because as you said before, nothing is new. Right? This is all the same. And so the journey into liberalism, the journey into progressivism, it's the same thing. So ultimately, that was the long way of saying I think it's basically the same, but there are cultural reasons why we've abandoned that term.
And then I think what led to that discussion is you had a couple people on, and we're going to talk about one of them in depth here, but you have Brian McLaren on and Philip Yancey. Brian McLaren, I think, would give himself the moniker of progressive Christian. Yancey might not. Yancey might still think of himself as a evangelical. The reason I bring up Philip Yancey in particular is that he had a profound impact on me during my Christianity. The Jesus I never knew hit me right at that time when I was a youth pastor, feeling very isolated and alone. It expanded Christianity for me in a way that probably made it drag on a little bit longer for me. But he was kind of the intellectual outlet for a Christian who is a bit of a skeptic, a little bit of doubts, that kind of thing. And so I have a soft spot in my heart for him. Well, you guys got the opportunity to interview him on this side of deconstruction, deconversion, and it was quite an experience for you. So I'd like you to talk about why you had him on, what it was like having him on, and then you guys had to process it after it was done as well.
Yeah, and I think it was the same for us. And Troy even, spoke to Philip in the episode, saying the profound influence that he had on him was to a point where he actually got a tattoo of the word grace in
Yeah,
Chinese.
yeah.
So it was, I think that what's so amazing about Grace, that book that he wrote, for me, was one of the most impactful books that I ever read as a Christian. And I think it was because I read at that time where I was just going, I was bought in through this whole forgiveness and grace story. I'm not feeling it. Like I'm actually feeling judgment, and I'm feeling an incredibly constrained environment. So I was questioning that. The book was, yeah, it was powerful, but he also dropped another book, which is his memoirs, Where the Light Fell, and it was reading that I actually felt a deeper connection to him because he was incredibly vulnerable in that book. He told the stories of growing up. He told the warts and all of the church. Um, so having him on we were fanboying. Both of us were absolutely fanboying, and the conversation was great. It was deep. It was authentic. Um, but he very much still does identify as an evangelical. He's disappointed with where evangelicalism has gone in the States, and he's vocal about that. but he's still deeply evangelical and believes in the roots of it. And he's still very much a Christian. He still believes in the tenets of Christianity. We were really clear before we got him on, and we were having conversations with him saying, we are not Christians. We do not believe anymore. And he said, great. These are the sort of
Yeah.
people I want to connect with. He goes, these are the, I would, his words he said to us was, I would hope that the evangelical community would connect with my new book. That's who I want to reach. That's who I want to read my story. So it was an interesting episode because you can't dislike Philip Yancey. He's genuine. you know, he might be touting beliefs that we don't any longer believe, but he's genuinely doing that and genuinely engaging. However, cognitive dissonance all the way through the conversation, but you couldn't not like him. But then when we dropped that episode, it was a real polarization, I think, with our listener community, which is our Facebook community of people going, "Oh my God, I loved Philip. What a great conversation," and others going, "What the fuck? Why did you talk to him? You're
Yeah.
still deeply in it." And people really wrestled with the content there because we also, we did connect with him, I think, during the interview. And for us, there was a real unsettling after it. Like we spoke after it and went, "Oh my God, wasn't that amazing?" And then listened back to the episode and went, "What the fuck? What happened there? We're under a spell." But we had to, so we dropped that episode, and then the next week we dropped a debriefing episode and a deconstruction of that episode and what was happening for us. So it was full on. But like if you have a listen to the episodes, which it sounds like you have, like we're really trying to process it. And we're going, what went on here, Troy? What are your thoughts around it?
Well, yeah, it's even hard now thinking about it and thinking how much we did fanboy him. We were just all over him, you know. It was like, oh, we got Philip Yancey because there was a part of us that was, all of a sudden we were 20 something again and we were interviewing Philip Yancey for God's
Mm,
sake. It was
yeah.
it was really really cool. But that said, I was afraid he was going to see us as a mission field. I'm sure he did on some level, but I was
Right.
afraid he was going to come on and high and mighty, but he didn't. And his book is really really good. I mean, his book, you could read that as a non-believer and just think this is amazing. As I've said before, it's a combination of To Kill a Mockingbird and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's just wonderful. It's a really really good book. I think it still comes through that at the end there is crazy religious mother, there's crazy atheist brother, and there's middle road evangelical Philip Yancey kind of thing. And I think that's implicit that this is the right path. And I don't know necessarily that that's the case even for his own family. Um, but yeah, it challenged us to say, what do you do with evangelicals who aren't Trump supporters, who aren't politically motivated to tear democracy down, and yet are good people and are doing good things and are, you know, intellectually addressing the inconsistencies of their faith. And that's when I thought, I think it comes down to labels again. And this is what I said. I think he's a liberal. I think he's a progressive, maybe not theologically, but socially and even politically, he's quite progressive. And I think that's where the rubber hits the road. It's what people are doing, not what they, sort of believe in their own private world.
I think that's the cognitive dissonance bit. Like he's definitely he's talking the words of Christianity and evangelicalism, but he seems to be living the life of a progressive. And I can't remember in the episode if we put it to him of where he sees himself at. I can't remember any of that, but we'll have to go back and have a listen. Actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he did because we asked him, what about the term evangelical? And he said, well, maybe one day I'll have to stop using that term if it continues to go the way that it's going. So, he's aware, but it's labels, it's
Sure.
badges.
If I could be so bold as to talk about a way to process that, there's a leader whose name is escaping me other than his first name, James, of the St. Louis Ethical Society. he made a statement once on Twitter that he probably has already forgotten, but it stuck with me. Basically, that everything is secular, everything is a human endeavor, and that religion is included in that. And so, what we do when we're religious is still secular, still humans trying to figure out the world to connect with each other. And I think Yancey's well within that, in the sense that he is a religious humanist and he cares about people and he's expressing that. And so, just the same way that meeting atheists or LGBTQ people when we were within our faith shook that. You meet Yancey and it's kind of the opposite of it. It's just because this is a good human being you're talking to, and so that's what you're connecting with. It would be my interpretation of the experience.
I think so, and I think also, hearing what you were saying about your experience of Philip Yancey and also our experience of Philip Yancey is he's doing a good thing. He's
Yeah,
actually helping fundamentalists be less fundamentalist. And as I said, if we hadn't got his book from the Christian bookshop, we probably would have said this is too liberal. But they did a bait and switch. We went into the fundamentalist bookshop, bought a fundamentalist book, and were impacted with humanist ideas. Oh my God. And it did push both Brian and I, and from what I'm hearing from you as well, it did push us in a good direction. So kudos to him, you know, kudos to him.
yeah. And I think you guys said that he probably wouldn't like to hear that, but that he was a part of your deconstruction. Quick, I don't want this to turn into a fanboy session about Philip Yancey, but quick side note: when I went to buy the Jesus I Never Knew, very very conservative Christian bookstore, and I got just glaring looks as I was buying the book from the bookseller. like it was understood that he was definitely more liberal, and there's something different about him even at the time. So
One of the things that I wanted to ask him, which I didn't get to ask him, was that Marcus Borg wrote a book called Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, which sounds a lot like The Jesus I Never Knew. And I wondered if Philip Yancey hadn't read that book and thought, I want to bring an evangelical version because it comes back to the person of Jesus, aside from all the religious stuff that we've gone through and all the doctrines, etc. Let's come back and look at this person of Jesus and meet him again for the first time, or the Jesus that I never knew. And I would really like to know if Marcus Borg had actually impacted Philip Yancey, or if he would even admit that, because Marcus Borg's book was first.
I haven't actually read that, so maybe someday if I'm interested, I'll do that. As we wrap up, guys, I want to focus back on your podcast and the community that you're building. How can people find the community, and maybe just talk a little bit about what is going on in the community that you guys are building?
Sure. Well, the podcast is available on all the good platforms, and as Brian likes to say, some of the bad ones too.
Yes.
We have, obviously, we're on social media. We're on Instagram. We had to be pushed onto Instagram because we're both in our 50s. We didn't know about the Instagram, but we are now on Instagram. We're on Twitter. We'll see how long that lasts. We're on Facebook as well. We have that Facebook community. And look, we have communities of people that are volunteering behind the scenes to help us out. um, People can connect with us in the different social media platforms, because we do tend to respond. We read pretty much everything. Matter of fact, there's times where I have to say, oh, I've got to put this down for a little while. It could become an obsession. But we try to make it meaningful, and we try to make ourselves available to people. I think the fact that we have this uniquely Australian voice makes us different. And I think some of our American audience sometimes grab their pearls. Do you know what I mean by that? They're like,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah,
did they just say that? And that's very Australian. And I think that's unique. And some people have actually said to us from foreign audiences, it's nice to hear you guys saying stuff that we would never dare say in our own accent, and that makes it kind of distant yet the same, in the same moment. So we welcome people from around the world, but it's uniquely Australian in our experiences. But as you've said, David, and we've said to you, it's still the same shit, different bucket.
yeah. Yes.
And I think it's the great thing about living in a nation that was founded for convicts is that we're just irreverent. It's in our
Yeah.
DNA. We definitely dwell in that irreverent place. But I think the Facebook community is definitely a place where people connect most. As I think I said before, there's about 800 people in that community as we speak. The podcast has gone mental in compared to our expectations. Nominated for an Australian Best Podcast Award for Current Affairs. By the time this goes to air, we'll know whether we got the gong.
Yep.
But it's just amazing to actually think that people are connecting with two ordinary blokes living in Australia.
And if we do win, I think we need to stand up the front and say, we just want to thank God for this podcast. Because if it wasn't for God, the podcast wouldn't exist, right?
That's right. If it wasn't for a God that doesn't exist, then the podcast wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
I think that is the ultimate mic drop. And Troy and Brian, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks heaps, Dave.
Thank you, David.
Final thoughts on the episode. You might notice I'm a little subdued. My voice is a bit subdued. I have not been feeling very well. I'm feeling a little better now, but if my voice is different, that is why. I really love what Troy and Brian are doing with their podcast and particularly with their community. It is so much like this podcast. It's amazing. You can hear in the interview the realness that comes through in their stories. They both had experience in the Assemblies of God and were around the influence of Hillsong, if not directly at Hillsong. And then I thought it was interesting that during their deconstruction, they called themselves Baptist-Costals, that they were going to a theologically Baptist church, but that had charismatic leanings. Troy's story of getting himself kicked out so that he can have sex is well worth it. You've got to go listen to that episode for sure. I really appreciated Brian's discussion in this interview about the influence of his brother becoming a evangelical Christian and him going to visit, assuring them that he was not going to be converted, and he got converted. So there is the acknowledgement of the power of religion and the message and love bombing and all of those things. I really appreciated Troy and Brian's humor, their Australian humor, their distinctly Australian voice, as they say. I think that humor is a fantastic way to overcome what can be seen as tragedy, and they are doing that well. I've obviously related to both Troy and Brian because of reading many of Philip Yancey's books. It was really interesting to dive in and talk about their experience interviewing him and the misgivings that they had after interviewing Philip Yancey. That is a fine line that I walk constantly of who should be on the podcast, who do we platform. It is not always obvious what is going to work and what isn't. You can find I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist on all the podcast platforms. They also have a YouTube channel called I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. They also have a Facebook group that is associated with their Facebook page, so check that out. I will have links in the show notes. I will also have their link tree that has links to all kinds of their content. I want to thank Troy and Brian for being on the podcast, for being so honest. As we said, this really feels like a sister podcast. So many similarities. Definitely check them out. Thank you for sharing your stories. The secular grace thought of the week is about acceptance, accepting yourself, accepting others. I keep finding people in my life who, when they finally realize that I accept them for who they are entirely, without reservations, without misgivings, completely open up, and I get to see that person for who they really are, and they stop hiding. And that lesson is definitely true for myself. When I have had the opportunity to really tell my story to someone, to really tell where I'm at, where my heartaches are, that has been a profound and cathartic experience. And I actually mean this in many areas beyond just religion. But what we are doing here on the podcast is giving a platform for people to tell their story. And telling your story is profound, is cathartic. And becoming a part of a community where people express their acceptance of you is life-changing. I want to encourage you all to do 3 things. 1, to accept yourself for who you are and not to beat yourself up. Embrace your humanity. You don't need to be something else or someone else. You can be yourself, and that is not only enough, that is fantastic. 2, try to show secular grace for other people, that they need that much acceptance as well, and be the person who is safe for others to come to and tell their story and be vulnerable. And 3, if you haven't yet told your story on this podcast and you have had a faith transition of one kind or another, I'd love to have you on. And I'd also love you to become a part of the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook community to experience that acceptance in the group. Reach out to me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. The Facebook group is at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. Next week, I have Rachel Hunt from Recovering from Religion. That was an amazing conversation. I can't wait to share that with you. I've got a number of community members lined up and a couple of interviews done. I still have Jennifer Michael Hepp coming up. The interview will be later this month, and that episode will come out in early March. Her new book is The Wonder Paradox, and it is fantastic. Go check that out. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. The beat is called Waves by Mackay Beats. If you want to get in touch with me to be a guest on the show, email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. For blog posts, quotes, recommendations, and full episode transcripts, head over to gracefulatheist.com. This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast